Okay, we're good to go. It is 6 o'clock. Thanks everyone for attending. I can see participants are streaming in. Welcome to the first webinar of 2022. I'm really excited to have Dr. Marco Festa-Bianchet speaking with us tonight. So a bit of background around these webinars. The goal of these webinars is to help educate our members and the public and people who care about fish, wildlife, and habitat so that they can engage with their elected officials and their MPs and their MLAs and talk to their coworkers. So, we'll probably have 100 and something people on tonight, but if all of you can talk to 3 or 4 people about what you learn, then that helps spread the message and helps hopefully propel us to better outcomes for conservation. So the history on this particular webinar, Dr. Festa-Bianchet has spoken at the BCWF AGM in the past. Really a big part of the impetus was the discussion around what's going on in Region 4 in the Kootenays around bighorn sheep and the discussions about moving to limited entry hunting from the current season, and had a number of discussions with provincial biologists and wildlife managers over the last number of months, and there was concern about harvest and around kind of some of Dr. Festa-Bianchet's work in Alberta on Ram Mountain and implications around genetic harm. So I thought, as hunters and conservationists, we would want to know first if there were better ways to have hunting seasons or harvest, and what we should do about that. So that was kind of the impetus, is if there's information and data out there, we should be the first ones to know so that we can adjust and adapt to ensure that hunting is sustainable. So that's the history and the background to this one. How it'll work tonight is Dr. Festa-Bianchet is going to present for probably 40 to 45 minutes. Then we'll move into Q&A. Keep in mind for the Q&A, when you ask questions, Dr. Festa-Bianchet doesn't set the hunting regulations or decide on policy. He is here exclusively as a scientist and a researcher, so he can tell us his perspective and give us the science, but he can't change the outcome or make those kind of regulatory decisions. So you'll see in your chat box, there's a Q&A button. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please press that, put your question in there. We'll keep track of all of them. At the end of it, we'll move into Q&A, and I will aggregate a bunch of the questions, ones that are overlapping, so that we're not asking the same question twice, and we'll try to keep it as efficient as possible. And so the other piece there is I just want to be mindful of Dr. Festa-Bianchet's time, because he's calling in from the other side of the country. So it is now 9 o'clock his time, so it's a late night. So a quick introduction. Dr. Festa-Bianchet received his PhD at the University of Calgary, then did a postdoc at Cambridge in the UK. He was hired at the University of Sherbrooke in 1990 and became a full professor in 1999. He's interested in how individual differences in size, growth, age, sex, and genotype, among a number of other things, affect the evolutionary ecology and population dynamics of large herbivores. He's currently working on bighorn sheep, caribou, and eastern gray kangaroos. His previous work was with mountain goats, fallow deer, Alpine chamois, and Ibex. His research is based on long-term monitoring of marked individuals. He is currently supervising 39 master's students and 23 PhD students. He's published over 240 refereed scientific articles. From 2002 to 2006, he was the chair of the CSIWIC, so Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, who we've worked with on the steelhead file. And for 16 years, he was the chair of the Mountain Ungulate Specialist Group of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So again, we have a phenomenal world-class researcher here to talk to us about evolution and selective harvest. So with that, Dr. Festa-Bianchet, if you could share your screen, and would like to thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff. While I get set up sharing my screen, I would like to thank you and the BC Wildlife Federation for inviting me. I think it's extremely important that I talk to conservation and hunting groups about this subject, because I think the way it's been bandied around, it does need a little bit of clear in the air, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present what it is that I actually do and what the implications are. So can you see my screen, and are we okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so the point tonight is to look at when selective hunting can lead to evolutionary change, and is that an issue? Should we do anything about it? So that's me in the picture. I'm the one wearing a hat. And before I go on, I should acknowledge the contribution of Roxanne Lassis, my PhD student, who is currently working on the consequences of harvest in all of Canada for all mountain sheep, and who's provided me with many of the graphs that I'll be showing you tonight, especially the more recent graphs that have to do particularly with British Columbia. So I've been working with mountain ungulates for a little over 40 years now. I done most of my research on bighorn sheep. I've also worked with mountain goats. I work with Alpine Ibex and with Alpine chamois. And you can see that the common thread in all these pictures I've shown you is these animals have tags in their ears. So what I'm interested is, as Jess pointed out, what are the consequences of individual differences on population dynamics and evolution ecology? And I'm particularly interested in monitoring individuals ideally from birth to death. I'm also a hunter. I am into mountain ungulates because I'm interested in hunting in the mountains, and I'm also interested in fishing, particularly ice fishing. And as my work in conservation has developed, I've done some contributions to things like producing the IUCN guiding principles on trophy hunting. There is a lot of bad press about trophy hunting. In fact, I wish we could get rid of the word trophy and just stick to hunting. But the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has produced these guidelines of when hunting can be called conservation hunting, and I was involved with that. I was also involved with this article in Science that came out a few years ago with over 100 other scientists pointing out that under some circumstances that simply banning the import of trophies actually causes negative consequences for biodiversity, because if you don't, and this particularly has to do with places like Africa and Asia, if you don't allow habitat to be used for sport hunting, it gets converted to agriculture and other uses. So I like to point that out because some of you may have been hearing stuff about me, particularly unpleasant rumors coming out, mostly of places like Alberta. None of it is true. I'm not the anti-hunting propagandist that you might have heard. So now that we cleared that up, let's get into the meat of the subject today. And the main issue really is that animals like this bighorn sheep ram have these large horns that have been selected for sexual selection because under some circumstances, these large horns help them get higher mating success. Those large horns make them attractive to hunters. So you can see this particular individual was illegally shot in the Sheep River Provincial Park in Alberta, was hitting the horns. You can see the wound in his horns, and got to live another 2 or 3 years after he was hit, and eventually was run over by a vehicle. But the point is, these large horns, high mating success for mature rams, also what hunters want. Now, mountain sheep in most of Canada are under a set of regulations that specify what kind of animals you can shoot and what kind of animals you cannot shoot. And what I'm going to try and tell you today is when the selective hunting, which in the particular case of mountain sheep is mostly forced by regulation, will lead to evolution, so a change in horn size and possibly shape. Well, if you're going to have evolution, you need the selective pressure and you need an inheritable trait. And horn size is inheritable. We've shown that using a pedigree or a mountain, and it's not rocket science, it's nothing too surprising. It's the standard heritability that you get for the morphological characteristics of a mammal. If you look at heritability of size, leg length, horn size, you find that somewhere between a third and a quarter is determined by genes. So we have strong data showing that horn size is inheritable. It's affected by all kinds of other variables. It's affected by weather, it's affected by nutrition, it's affected by disease. But the point remains that if your dad had big horns, if your paternal grandfather had big horns, you probably will have bigger horns than the average in the population. So you need an inheritable trait. Then you need intense long-term selective harvest. Not just any selective harvest, but it has to really make sure that if your horns grow quickly, you get shot. And it has to go on for many years to counterbalance the fact that natural selection favors rams that have large horns. So it really needs to be intense. And that's where the key comes in, that it's something that's actually quite easy to avoid. You just need to lower the selective pressure. If you want to select for small horn, the best thing you can do is apply the selective pressure early in life. So you have to kill these large horn rams before they get a chance to breed, so that none of their genes stay in the population. You also need to do it consistently over a very large area, because if you're doing this over a small area, well, you're probably going to get immigrants that are going to swamp this selective effect. And if you have immigrants that come from places like, let's say, national parks where sheep are protected, you should shoot them before they get a chance to participate in breeding. If you have this series of characteristics, you would expect that selective hunting would lead to evolution. If you don't, you may not expect an evolutionary change. Unfortunately, this list of characteristics pretty much describes the way bighorn sheep are managed in the province of Alberta, as you will see in a moment. Now, those are the characteristics, those are the conditions you need for evolution. You also need to know about the mating system of bighorn sheep, because one of the points I'll be trying to make tonight is that bighorn sheep are really, they have several characteristics that make them more likely to show this evolutionary change under very intensive selective hunting. When they use an estrus during the rut, dominant rams, like these two indicated here, better is a pointer, like this one and that one, will try to defend her. Mating system of bighorn sheep is such that if you have one estrus ewe today, the dominant ram will defend her. Let's say this is the dominant ram, he will defend the ewe, everybody else will take on an alternative mating strategy, essentially try to separate the dominant ram from the ewe. If there is two ewes in estrus on the same day, one will be defended by this one, the other one will be defended by this other one, and the other ones will take on these alternative strategies. So these are the rams. They're too small, they're subordinate, they cannot defend an estrus ewe. What they will try to do is to separate the ewe from the dominant ram and force a copulation. So for these large rams, horn size is important because that's what helps in establish the dominance rank and get to the top position where they can defend the ewe. For this younger one, horn size is not very important. It's really a matter of how much risk they want to take, how fast they are, how agile they are. So horn size will drive mating success, but only for mature rams that can defend the ewe. And some of the subordinate rams will have some mating success. So if a dominant ram is defending the ewe, he has about, on average, a 60% chance of being the father of the lamb, which means that about 40% of the lambs are fathered by these smaller subordinate rams that are using these alternative strategies. So if we put that all on a graph, and here I'm looking at mating success of individual rams, looking at the relative horn lengths along this axis. So these are rams with large horns, positive values. These are rams with small horns, negative values. And here's the age, from 2 to 14 years. You can see that for rams aged between about 2 and 6, this is a flat surface, meaning how big the horns are doesn't make a whole lot of difference to their mating success. The rams have to be at least 7 years of age, rut as a 7-year-old, and then if they got large horns, then their mating success goes way up. And again, it has to do with what I was saying here, that if you're young and subordinate, your horn size doesn't matter very much. But if you're older and dominant, then if you have large horns, you're in the sweet spot up here, you're the dominant ram, you get to defend the estrus ewe, and you get to defend serious estrus ewes during the rut, and you can have very high mating success. So positive effect of horn size, starts at about age 7. Of course, there's going to be some variability, depends on the age structure. But the point is that young rams, how big the horns are, makes fairly little difference to how many lambs they will sire. Now, here's the problem. This is a 4-year-old that was shot in Alberta. The definition used in most of Alberta is 4/5 of a curl, the definition of a legal ram. So the bit of plexiglass here is a way of showing the way the definition is applied. Essentially, if you can draw this imaginary line between the front of the horn, the tip of the eye, if that line intercepts the tip of the horn, the ram is legal. This was a 4-year-old. It was legal. Most 4-year-olds are not legal. This ram would probably have done very well had he survived to rut as a 7-year-old, but he got shot as a 4-year-old. His last rut was as a 3-year-old. He probably never sired. It's unlikely that he sired any lambs. So what do we got with hunting regulation in Alberta? We got what I like to call the perfect storm. There's no quotas. Any resident of the province can buy a license, and all he or she has to do is find a ram that fits this legal definition. If the horns of the ram grow quickly, he becomes legal when he's 4 or 5. So the negative selection from the hunt, the probability of getting shot because the ram has made it to legal size, starts at the age of 4 or 5. The positive effect, those large horns will help him get a lot of mating, starts at about 7 years of age. So the negative selection comes in about 1 to 3 years earlier than positive selection, and it counteracts the positive selection. Essentially, if you have small horns, you're more likely to survive. You're more likely to survive to age 8 or 9, and you're more likely to produce a lot of descendants. The other point that needs to be underlined here is that this selective pressure, based on the definition of a legal ram, is very strong. And this is something on which we tend to have not a lot of data. At Ram Mountain, because all these animals were marked, Ram Mountain is in central Alberta, west of Red Deer, west of Rocky Mountain House, by the way. It's sort of in the middle of the Rockies in Alberta. All the animals have been marked for over 50 years, so we can calculate the probability that a legal ram will get shot, and it's about 40%. It's very hard to get this data. And one of the criticism of this research has been things like, well, we only shoot 2% of the herd. How can that have a selective effect? Well, 90% of the herd is made up of illegal rams, ewes, and lambs. So only rams are shot. Then you say, well, we're taking less than 10% of the rams. How can that have a selective effect? Well, most of the rams are not legal. Really, what you need to measure the selective pressure is what is the probability that if you are a legal ram, you will get shot. A ram mounted, the probability is up to 40%. From what we are finding out from, the legal ram comes in and try to estimate, okay, how many years was this ram legal before he got shot? In the rest of the province, it's probably higher than 40%. It varies according to region, but overall, it's probably somewhere between 30 and maybe as high as 80%. With a 40% harvest rate, if the ram is legal at age 4, its chances of making to rut at age 7, once you combine several years of hunting season, natural survival, is about 8%. Very, very few legal at 4 makes it to rut as a 7-year-old. If that same ram is not legal until he's 8, his chances of surviving to rut at age 7 are 60%. So this is a substantial difference. There's a very, very strong selection because of the intense pressure, 8% versus 60%. What you're seeing here on the right is a picture I took at the Australian National Museum. On the left side of the plexiglass is what merino sheep, wool-producing domestic sheep looked like when they were first brought to Australia in the late 1800s, and this is what they look like now. About 50 years of director selection has produced a sheep that is much larger. Several generations of director selection the other way in places like Alberta are producing sheep that have smaller horns, and here's what the data for Ram Mountain look like. Let's spend some time understanding what this slide means. Here we have the cohort, so the year when rams were born. And we go from the mid-70s to about 2011 or 12. This is age-corrected horn lengths. You can imagine 0 is the overall average, 10 are large, positive values are large horns, negative values are small horns. The blue line is the total length of the horns, is what we can call the phenotypic measure, is what you actually measure on the ram. The orange line is what's important here, because this is what's determined from the pedigree, and it's the genetic contribution to horn size. It's the same technique that people use, if you're raising dairy cattle, you can use the same technique based on a pedigree, how much milk did your mother produce, how much milk did your grandmother produce, your father's mother, etc. And this is what farmers use to select cattle that produce, say, more milk, better meat, whatever. The point here is that over these 23 years or so of very intense selective hunting, the genetic component of horn size declined, and it declined significantly, but a whole lot less than this large decline, the blue line, which was caused mostly by an increase in density. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, horn size is affected by density, nutrition, disease, weather, etc. But here we've isolated the genetic part. So this is actual evolution in action. The dotted line here is 1996, when the legal definition of a mountain was changed from 4/5 of a curl to full curl. And given that the rams were pretty small by then, essentially that stopped the hunt. It was actually totally stopped in 2010, but very, very few rams were shot after 1996. And you can see that this decline stops. So what was causing this genetic decline here was the pressure from the selective hunt. And then the trend was reversed. It's important to note that the genetic decline was about 2.5 centimeters over 3 sheep generations. So sheep generation is the average age of your parents. A generation is the average age of your parents. For bighorn sheep, it's about somewhere between 6 to 7 years. So here is 23 years of data. 3 sheep generation decline of 2.5 centimeters. And I really want to point out how small the genetic decline was, because our work has been misinterpreted by people who say, well, we're trying to pretend that this entire 18 centimeters decline was genetic. No, it was not. Much of the variability was not due to genetics, was due to mostly population density, but we can definitely pick up this genetic decline. So what is the overall take-home message from the ram mountain study? Horn size has a positive effect on the sighting success of mature rams, plays very little role for young rams. It has strong heritability, so about 40% of the variation in horn size is due to genetics. A very intense, no quota, 40% harvest, trophy hunting led to evolution of smaller horns, about a 2.5 centimeter decline, which stopped when the hunt stopped. So pretty strong evidence of an evolutionary change. So that's the story from Ram Mountain. It's a small, isolated population with limited gene flow. You could reasonably ask, well, does this happen somewhere else? Is this just something that happens at Ram Mountain, or can we extend this over a broader geographical scale? Well, there are another population with pedigree that we can study. So what we can look at is harvest data. The province of Alberta, the province of British Columbia, for many decades have had compulsory registration of mountain sheep horns. So when the hunter takes a sheep, he or she has to bring it in, and the horns are measured. Very important point in British Columbia, not just the horns are measured, but the annuli are measured. They only started measuring them in Alberta a few years ago, and you see how important it is to measure those annuli. An 8-year-old ram is shot, comes in, you get 8 years of data on those horns. It's a good idea to measure them. Now, harvest data are useful because it's a large sample size over a wide geographical area, but they're biased. They're biased because of the regulation. And what that bias does, it creates 2 problems. If the horns are small, the rams cannot be shot. It's illegal to kill a short ram. So rams with small horns do not show up in your sample if you're only relying on harvest data. The second bias is that if the horns grow quickly, the ram is shot when it's young. The faster the horn growth rate, the younger the ram is shot. So you have to take that into account when you analyze the data, because you're not looking at a random sample of the population. You're looking at a sample that if the horns grow quickly, they show up in the sample when they're younger. And if the horns are small, you just don't see those rams because they don't show up in the sample. And just to give you an idea of how important this bias is, we're looking here at the horn growth from 1 to 5 years of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep rams shot in British Columbia. This is work from my former graduate student, Pam Hengeveld, that was published about 10 years ago. And because in British Columbia, at registration, the annual year measure, Pam was able to look at how much the ram had grown between 1 and 5 years, regardless of the age at which it was shot. So she excluded the lamb tip, because obviously that gets worn out and it tends to be worn out more with age. So this is really growth during, from the second summer of life to the 5th summer of life. And you can see that the decline is substantial. This is under full curve regulation. If the rams are shot when they're 5 or 6 years of age, the growth between 1 or 6 years is somewhere between average between say 61 and 66 centimeters. If they're shot when they're 10 or older, you're looking at maybe 49 to 52 centimeters. So it's about a 25, almost 30% decline. And you need to take this into account in the analysis. If the ram has a rapid horn growth, he's likely to get shot when he's young. Once you take the bias into account, what do these long-term registration data tell you? Well, in Alberta, the horns are shrinking. So this is from a paper that I published with several co-authors about 7 years ago. Here's the average horn length according to year of harvest in the whole province of Alberta. This is for 6-year-old, and you can see a decline of about maybe 3 centimeters. Not a huge decline. Again, don't forget that if the rams are small, they don't show up in your sample because hunters can kill them. But what I find is even more interesting is when you look at the age of harvest. And what the age of harvest suggests is that it's taking now longer for rams in Alberta to reach legal size than a few decades ago. If you look first here on the left, this is the average age according to harvest year. And it's going up from in the late 70s was somewhere between 6.8, 6.9, and in the 2010 is up to about 7.4, 7.5. And you must say, well, great, we want to shoot all the rams. This is good. Well, unfortunately, this increase in average age is entirely explained by what you're seeing here on the right, which is the proportion of the harvest that is made up of rams age 4 or 5. And you can see that in the 80s and early 90s, there were a number of years in which a quarter and sometimes a third of the harvest of the rams that were shot in the province of Alberta were age 4 or 5. Remember what I said earlier on, the best way to get evolution of smaller horns is to shoot these large horn rams before they get an opportunity to breed. If you shoot them when they're 4 or 5, that means the last rut when they were 3 or 4, they probably got no breeding success at all or very, very little. And overall, the harvest has declined. So in the late 70s, 80s, early 90s, the harvest of legal rams combining, well, in red here is the residents, the square here are the non-resident, so the triangles is the total. The overall harvest in Alberta was somewhere between 200 and 250 rams per year. In recent years, it's gone down to about 120, 125 to 100, let's say 175. During this time, the populations remain more or less stable. So the same number of sheep, probably about 7,000, it goes up a little bit, down a little bit, in provincial lands, was producing a little over 200 legal rams a year that were getting shot. And in recent years, it's gone down by about 40%. So there's been a decline in the harvest. I would say is because there is fewer legal rams in the population, partly because there's been selection for smaller horns. Obviously, there's a problem here. I don't have a control. The hunting regulation were pretty similar everywhere in Alberta during this time. So, maybe global warming, something else caused this change. And to look in more detail, to get a bit of a better picture of this potential selective effect, Mathieu Douard looked at data from stone sheep in British Columbia. And he separated animals that were taken in the peace area. So this would be the black line with very high, well, higher hunting pressure, and in the Skeena, the dotted line with a lower hunting pressure. What you're looking at here is early horn growth. Again, the annular measure. So this is growth during the third and fourth year, during the second and third year of life. And you can see that in the peace with a high hunting pressure, there's again a decline of about maybe 4 centimeters in this early growth. It's a flat line in the Skeena. So we're seeing a decline in horn size in an area with high hunting pressure and not in an area with lower hunting pressure, which is important because it tells us that this evolutionary change is not inevitable. If you lower the hunting pressure, you will avoid the problem. What are the consequences of this high hunting pressure? Well, the early horn growth declined by about 12%. Harvest declined in the peace by about 45% over this period. And the horns are shorter for the same base. It's not an overall shrinking of the horns. The bays are staying the same. What makes the ram legal under the full curl definition is how long they are, how long the horns are. So this change in shape of the horn, again, suggests there's been an evolutionary change. And again, in the Skeena during the same time, no trend in horn growth, no change in harvest, no change in horn shape. To me, this is pretty strong evidence that if you have very high hunting pressure, you get evolution of smaller horns. And the other way of looking at it is if you don't have very heavy hunting pressure, you don't get evolution of smaller horns. Will national parks fix this? Obviously, there's no hunting in national parks. And this is, again, the various sheep management areas in Alberta. And you see here the large national parks, Jasper, Banff, and down here, Waterton. And you might say, well, you know, there's no selective hunting in national parks. Maybe if rams move out to the parks, they'll fix this problem, or at least they'll swamp the selective effect. Well, that would happen if the hunting season closed before these rams start moving out of the parks. And that is not the case. So if we compare the size of horns of rams that are shot in areas away from the parks and near the national parks in Alberta, early in the hunting season, late in the hunting season, you see two things. The ones that are near the park tend to be slightly larger. Again, see, it's not a huge difference, maybe a centimeter. And late in the season, they tend to be larger, suggesting that these are larger, unselected rams coming out of national parks. While away from the parks, there is no seasonal trend. The average length of horns is the same early in the season as it is late in the season. And in late October, there is a peak in the harvest, particularly in the areas close to the park. So this is work by another graduate student, Joanna Poisson, and she looked at the temporal trend during the hunting season on when are these rams getting shot. And she compared areas that do not have a national park, a protected area within 25 kilometers, with areas that are near a protected area. So there is a national park or some other protected area within 25 kilometers, yes. If there is no protected area nearby, there is this large peak. Beginning is the first week of the hunting season, end is the last week, and middle is the 7 or 8 weeks in between. Probably the same thing happens in British Columbia. In Alberta, people go sheep hunting early in the season, late October, early September. Then they go on and hunt something else. So the harvest goes down. But in areas near the park, we see this peak in the last week of the hunting season, late October, when the harvest move closer to the national parks by about 20% or 3 kilometers. The size goes up a little bit. And what's happening here, at least some of this harvest, is these rams that are coming out of the national parks. So you don't get a genetic rescue if the rams get shot. So what have I told you so far? We've shown genetic evidence, direct genetic evidence of harvest-induced evolution from one population of a mountain, and evidence based on harvest data that there is a genetic decline in horn size, in bighorns in Alberta, and stone sheep in BC, in areas where there's very high hunting pressure. And there doesn't seem to be an effective genetic pressure from a protected area. So now let's look a little bit at the BC situation. because I thought this might interest you. And what I should say here is that the analysis I've shown you so far mostly come from published data, went through the peer review process, and they were analyzed taking into account environmental covariables, covariates, and various other things that could affect horn growth. What I'm going to show you now is mostly raw data from British Columbia. So the interpretation has to remain a little bit tentative. But I think some of the trends I'm going to show you really speak for themselves. Here's the age distribution. I know there is quite a bit of a preoccupation in British Columbia about the age of rams that are getting shot. This is for the Rocky Mountains. So under a full curve regulation, you can see the mode is at 8 years. And there's a few rams that get shot at 9, 10 years of age and older, but most are shot at 7 to 9 years. Again, this is over the overall period. It's interesting to look at the temporal change. And in this graph in black, we have rams. Again, it's the age structure of rams shot anywhere in the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia from 1975 to 2020. Black, rams younger than 8 years. Dark gray are 8-year-olds, and light gray are rams older than 8 years. And you can see there's been a substantial change in the age structure. So that in the 70s and early 80s, well over half of the harvest was made up of rams aged 7 years or younger. In recent years, the proportion of rams aged 7 years or younger, it's down to maybe a quarter or even a little bit less. So this is good. Of course, what we need to determine is, is this age structure of the harvest shifting because maybe hunters have been more selective, passing up younger rams, or is it because younger rams are no longer legal, like it was the case in Alberta? And before I go on to show you some data on horn size, given the preoccupation with this age structure of the harvest, I would just like you to compare British Columbia with Alberta. You're doing a whole lot better in BC than in Alberta. Look at the black line. This is about the same years. Alberta, rams, 8 years, younger than 8 years. Slight decline here, mostly because 4 and 5 year olds are no longer legal, but they're still making up well over half of the harvest. While in British Columbia, you're definitely taking rams from an older age structure. In other words, if it's important that the large horn ram survive to 7-year-old to breed during the rut, they got a much higher chance of surviving to 7-year-old on the western side of the continental divide than on the eastern slopes. And if you look at horn length of rams shot in the Rocky Mountain, British Columbia, just like this, and again, we'd have to take into account weather, density, other covariables, but I'm not seeing any obvious trend here. I'm not seeing either for 7-year-old or for 8-year-olds. This looks to me like a flat line. I'm not seeing a very strong decline. And maybe the best way of looking at it is to compare data from British Columbia to data from Alberta. Again, here we have 7-year-olds, here we have 8-year-olds. And it's kind of harder to see in Alberta because of the scale. The decline is only about 2-3 centimeters. But if you look, you can clearly see a decline, an average decline in size of 7-year-olds and of 8-year-olds here. While British Columbia kind of goes up and down. Obviously, there's a smaller sample in BC, so there's more variability. But what I showed you is happening in Alberta doesn't appear to be happening in British Columbia. And this is what Pam Hengeveld had already found when she published the paper 11 years ago. There was no decline in horn size of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep in BC. There was a decline in the horn size of interior or California bighorns, which are hunted under a 3/4 curl. So with the stronger selective regime, there was definitely evidence that in the interior BC, the rams were getting smaller, but not in the Rocky Mountains. So what's my take-home message from this talk? Harvest regulation can prevent evolutionary effect. Another way of looking at it, harvest regulation can cause evolutionary effect. And the regulation that we have currently in place in Alberta, that have been in place in Alberta for several decades, have caused an evolutionary shrinkage of bighorn sheep horns by maybe 2 or 3 centimeters. Okay, so much about mountain sheep. I really stress how mountain sheep have the perfect combination for an evolutionary change in horn size when the harvest is based on the morphology, their mating system, the fact that the horn size doesn't play a positive role until they're maybe 7 years of age and older, the way they're hunted, etc. What about other species? Do we have any evidence that this kind of hunting-induced change is happening in other species? Well, the short answer is no. And selection, the fact that hunters may select for a certain trait, does not necessarily lead to evolution. In many cases, we don't know how selective that harvest is. I pointed out, we very rarely know what is the probability of getting shot for a legal ram, and we have even less information for other species. And what's really important is that the mating system and what drives male reproductive success really have strong consequences on, really have strong effect on the consequence of selective hunting. And something that I think sometimes people are surprised to find out, we have no idea of individual mating success for males for most of the species. We need DNA-based evidence. We have it for 3 populations of bighorn sheep. Because of a long-term study at Ecology, we have it for mountain goats. In terms of North American ungulate, that's about it. There is some evidence for antelope. There is scattered data for some species of deer, goose, caribou, don't have a clue. Nobody has ever measured it. So there is a lot that we don't know. But one thing that's important here is to what extent does horn size drive male reproductive success? In sheep, is to a large extent. In other species, maybe not. So here's some work I did with a graduate student, Marco Ruggetti, on Alpine chamois. And Alpine chamois, which are sort of slightly related to mountain goat, have got this very strong compensatory horn growth, meaning that if they grow quickly in the first 2 years of life, again, the advantage of measuring annuli length. So here is how much this individual chamois male grew in the first 2 years of life. This goes from maybe 11 to 22 centimeters. How much they grew in the subsequent 2 years, age 3 or 4. And you see this very strong negative relationship. If they grow a lot during the first 2 years of life, then they slow down. If they grow less during the first 2 years of life, then they speed up, which means that the hunter that is looking for a large horn male chamois does not have the same effect as the hunter that is looking for a large horn male bighorn sheep, that he's likely to take a large horn male before he gets an opportunity to breed. Because in this case, because this compensatory growth, adult horn size is not very strongly related to how rapidly they grow early life. Another example, mountain goats. These are data from Julien Menguy from the Courage study. And in mountain goats, how big your horns are makes almost no difference to mating success. To be successful, the male mountain goat has to be big in terms of body size. So the billies are successful are these guys that weigh over 100 kilos. They get a higher annual reproductive success. Smaller males get very, very little. They get some. The reproductive success, the mating system is similar to that of bighorn sheep. But really what drives the success of male goats is not the size of the horns, is the size of their body. And the correlation between body size and horn size is very, very weak. Meaning that the hunter that looks for a billy goat with large horns is not necessarily going to take out the best reproducer in the population, because the correlation with mass, which drives mating success, is rather weak. It's not at all the same situation as with bighorn sheep. There's a fairly recent, very good paper on Alpine Ibex that showed that over several decades of hunting of Alpine Ibex in Switzerland, there was absolutely no evidence of evolutionary change. And I always kind of find it kind of funny that people are pointing to this paper, say, well, that kind of disproves your whole idea that selective hunting leads to evolution of small horns, because in the case of Ibex, the hunting is not selective. There's very strict quotas. If you're a resident and you want to shoot an Ibex, I shouldn't say can apply. You'll get drawn maybe once every 10 or 15 years. You're lucky if you get to take 2 over your lifetime. You have to take an age identification course, and your permit specify the age class that you can take. And interesting Swiss way of doing things, if you're a young hunter, you can only take a young male. If you want to take a big male like this 12-year-old, well, you need to be an old fart like me over 60. And it's 20 days of hunting, so it's very strictly regulated. It's completely the opposite of, say, the hunting regulation for sheep in Alberta. So again, hunting regulation can prevent this evolutionary change. So to wrap all this up, when will selective hunting will likely lead to evolution? The trait has strong heritability. We know horns have strong heritability. The trait is directly fitness related, meaning how big the horns are drives how much mating success the males will have. We find this in mountain sheep. We don't find it in mountain goats. Selective pressure is intense. If you have quotas, if you aim the harvest at older rams, you're not going to get the same evolutionary pressure. And selection is early in life will lead to a stronger evolution. The other way of looking at it is if your harvest is made up mostly of rams at age 8, 9, and older, you probably don't have a problem. As I showed you, in some years in Alberta, up to a third of the harvest, 4 and 5-year-old. And something we're still working on is the potential for genetic rescue from national parks. Again, if the rams that come out of national parks get shot to the boundary, they're unlikely to produce a genetic rescue. So that's all I had to tell you for today. I would like to thank the many students and collaborators that have come up with the idea, analyzed the data, produced the graph, and helped me in the field. Also a number of wildlife biologists from Alberta and British Columbia. We now extend our analysis to the Yukon and Northwest Territories. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And hopefully you heard all the stuff that I said, because I'm just kind of talking in the blank wall here, and I'll stop sharing my screen now to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Festa-Bianchet. I do have a couple of questions lined up right away here. Does faster horn growth correlate with larger horn size? Should that ram survive? And in that case, is it linear or sigmoidal growth, interannual variability of growth as well? So there's a number of questions packed in there, but the first one is, does faster horn growth correlate with larger horn size? Should that ram survive?
Yes, as far as we know, yes. Of course, the sample that we have is biased because fewer rams with rabbit horn growth survive. So in species like mountain goats and Alpine chamois, it looks like the male needs to have horns, but it doesn't need to have big horns. While in species like mountain sheep and ibex, it's clear the males that have large horns do better if they survive to a certain age. So the answer is yes. Of course, the horn growth slows down with age, but we're finding very little evidence in rams, in mountain sheep, of that compensatory growth that I was showing you for chamois, and that we find not quite as strong, but we find it also in mountain goat. So a mountain goat that's got very large horns as a 2-year-old will not necessarily have above average horns when he's 8. But a bighorn sheep who's got large horn at the age of 4 has a very high probability of developing into a very large rams when he's 8 or 9. Of course, things that happen, weather every year has an effect on horn growth. But in general, yes, if you have rapid early horn growth, you become a big ram.
Okay, and then the follow-up was, is it linear or sigmoidal growth?
Well, it's kind of quadratic in the sense that it kind of slows down. It's not sigmoidal. It's faster, early in life, and then it slows down. And then you get into these complicated questions about, we tend to measure the length, but as they get older, the volume increases. So, the length that's added to the horn is less and less, but not necessarily the volume, because obviously they're thicker at the base. So, but it generally does slow down. They keep growing through life. When they get to be maybe 9, 10 years of age, the growth in length tends to be very small because they bust their tips. One interesting other piece of information that we have that I haven't showed today is that if you look at size, particularly the base and age of harvest, in Alberta, the thicker bases are 5-year-olds, and then they decline. And that's not normal. What's happening is that if you have a rapidly growing ram with large bases, they get shot when they're 4 or 5, and then it's the smaller one that survives. So one really has to be careful in saying what the age-specific growth is. If you look at data from British Columbia, when you look at ram shot between 5 and say 10 years of age, they only go up by maybe 2 or 3 centimeters a year. But again, with the regulations the way they are, when they hit the legal size, they're likely to get shot.
Thank you. Okay, another one. What is high pressure from a sheep's perspective, or how do we identify too much pressure? And I guess, and we will probably get more questions around this, hunting regulations and stuff. So is this about, really, is it about changing the harvest rate, or is it moving the selective nature off of those young, fast-growing rams? Like, I guess what's optimal from like a sheep's perspective or from a biological perspective?
What I think we need is to have hunting regulation that ensure that at least some of these rams with rapid horn growth make it to rut as a 7-year-old. It's not so much a question of the age structure, because there are older rams in Alberta, but the point is, because the selective hunt, those older rams all have small horns, and they're the ones that get to do a lot of the breeding. I cannot tell you what level of harvest will and will not produce an evolutionary change. What I can tell you, look at the empirical data, is that what we're seeing in Alberta suggests that there's been an evolutionary change. What we're seeing in BC, in the interior, with California bighorn sheep, with stone sheep in the Peace, suggests an evolutionary change. We also have very, very little data, as I mentioned, in terms of what is the actual hunting pressure on legal rams. Out of 100 legal rams that are there at the start of the season, how many get shot? It's really hard to get that kind of information. But to me, the easiest way to look at is if the harvest is mostly 8-year-olds and older, you're probably doing okay, and you're surely doing better than if the harvest, like I was showing, even now in Alberta, the average age of harvest is under 8. So, in the absence of more detailed data, I would aim for an age of harvest that is 8 years of age, 8 years and older. It may be different for thin horns. I was a bit surprised that we found an evolution effect given, the full curve regulation and the fact that most of the rams shot are 7 years of age and older. So maybe there is something about the mating system or the survival of thin horns that is different from what we know from big horns. But I cannot tell you, what rate of harvest is going to lead to an evolutionary change. There was a recent paper that came out comparing temporal changes in horn growth in Alberta with places in the States where they tend to have a much more conservative harvest regime. And again, it showed that while in Alberta, horn size is declining all over the place, in the States, it's more or less stable. It's declining in some, going up in others, but overall, it's not nearly strong evidence of decline. Again, the harvest, in Colorado, I'm told that if you apply for a ram when you're 16 and you keep applying until you're 65, you got something like less than 10% chance of being drawn once. So the hunting pressure is much lower. And you look at the age of rams that are taken, it's mostly 8, 9 years old and older.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thanks. And then you may have covered this. Other than hunters caring about horn size, what are the fitness consequences to shrinking horn size? Are populations with smaller horn size less fit or viable? I know you cover this in when you publish, but did you cover that today around lamb size and recruitment, all that stuff?
No, I didn't talk about it today because I wanted to stay within 45 minutes and I really wanted to show some data from British Columbia. So the genetic component of horn size is correlated with traits that affect the fitness of individuals. So we have increasingly finding evidence that these rams with genetically larger horns produce essentially better lambs. It's not a huge effect, but it's something that worries me, because if the only consequence of selective hunting is that horns shrink a little bit, well, so what? I mean, yeah, hunters are not going to be very happy. There's going to be fewer legal rams, but other than, if you want to get into questions about sustainability and evolution sustainability, it may not be a big deal. We do have some evidence that when it's this extreme selective hunt, it does affect the fitness of the population. It's certainly not the main factor driving population dynamics, but it does look like there might be some effect. The data that we have on that are not nearly as strong as the data on evolutionary success, but we do find essentially genetic correlation between horn size and size of the lambs, survival of the lambs, larger, the quality of the offspring of these rams. But again, I like to underline their weak effect. And that's something that, again, I want to underline also for the horn size. When I talk about shrinking, it's not that they're half as big. We are picking up a few centimeters of genetic change, which we can attribute to a selective hunt, but it's not, suddenly you got rams with half as big horns as they used to be.
Okay, thanks. We do have a number of questions that are kind of following this line of, how do we manage sheep sustainably, and what do these regs mean for us? So I know you're not super, that some of this is going to be a little bit too nuanced for localized areas. What are the, so what somebody says, presumably a full curl regulation in Alberta that mirrors the one in BC would help in Alberta. What are the main challenges to that? I guess would be the question.
Well, the challenges are political. So I think we know how to fix this. And certainly moving to full curl will be a step forward. There are a few areas in Alberta that have moved to full curl. Typically what happens is there'll be 2-3 years with essentially no harvest, which is again another sign that essentially all the legal rams have been taken. And then the harvest picks up, and it's interesting how moving from forfeit to full curl, you probably add on average maybe 1.5, probably less than 2 years to the life expectancy of rams, but you do get a few more that make it to rut as a 7-year-old. The other thing that probably would have a pretty major positive effect would be to close the season 2 weeks earlier, because then you wouldn't get this harvest of the rams that are coming out of national parks. Obviously, people don't like that because that's when a lot of the rams get taken. I really don't think that for social reason it's feasible to go to a draw. And the reason why I don't think that's feasible is because if we want to decrease the harvest, let's say right now they're taking about 150, 170 rams in Alberta. Suppose we want to move that closer to maybe 100 per year. Probably wouldn't be able to give out more than 200 permits. And right now there's about 3,000 people that go hunting sheep. So it would really be a huge negative effect on the number of people that have the opportunity to go hunt sheep. But I think that with a full curl, closing the season, maybe 2 weeks earlier, the fish and wild biologists are all in agreement that this needs to be done in Alberta. The reason why it's not happening is political. I mean, I wasn't kidding when I said there has been some pretty nasty propaganda about myself and my research that's been diffused in that province. And unfortunately, in a number of these quarters, you hear my name and people walk out, which is why I appreciate being able to talk to you guys, because I'm not this kind of, Voldemort-like person that hates hunters.
Okay. Here's one. So, and we'll get into a bit around just sheep ecology generally. Does human pressure on sheep hunting during summer and fall months from hikers and hunters disrupt feeding patterns? And can it have a significant impact on sheep health and horn growth?
Not that I know of. Obviously, it depends on the degree. You go into national parks, sheep are habituated to people. It's hard to, they're not like mountain goats. In places where people go with dogs, in places where there's a lot of hikers during the hunting season, maybe. But, at least my experience in Alberta is that sheep tend to habituate to people. I mean, you know, the oil installation, you have to build fences around them to keep the sheep away. So again, I hesitate to say because I don't have any actual data, but from what I've seen, I don't think the disturbance would play a huge role. It may, unless people have dogs. Sheep hate dogs because, you know, they think they're wolves. So free-range dogs, definitely that I would see that would be a problem. Again, it's a matter of intensity. You know, if there is a dog chases after them once every couple of weeks, it's not a big deal. If there's one every day, and, you know, as an aside, we're picking this up. I've done some work on cougar predation, and we have another graduate student looking at the effect of cougar predation. We find that in years with heavy cougar predation, the sheep are smaller because they spend all this time being alert, and so they gain less weight. We haven't looked at horn growth yet, but the lambs are smaller. There's higher mortality of lambs independent of predation. I think dogs would have the same effect. They don't react as much to helicopter as mountain goats. Helicopter are a disaster for mountain goats. But again, if you're in an area where there's a whole lot of heli hiking, heli skiing, maybe that could be a problem, because they do react to helicopters, not as much as mountain goats, but you know, if the helicopter comes by close, they will run.
Okay, great. Back onto it. So there's a lot on regulations, and so I'll focus in on one piece is there's a few questions around slot limits. So again, this is going to come back to, you know, do you go selective 8+, or do you reduce the harvest rate and see what having, you know, harvesting across the age, you know, all of these age classes, if the harvest is lower, you know, will that increase escapement? And then what does that mean? So, I mean, I know this is not like, this is more management, but there's a lot of questions like, can we go to a slot limit? Can we just focus on 8+? And so maybe I'll just ask you again if you have thoughts on that.
Well, 8+ sounds great. Frankly, I have a hard time understanding how that can be enforced in the courts. Because if I'm 200 meters away, I cannot guarantee you that I can tell you an 8-year-old from a 7-year-old. So there's that issue, but clearly 8+ is good. Slot sizes, I don't know. I mean, escapement will be the key. There is a lot of places in the States that have now gone to any ram. And I think there's a few places in British Columbia now, particularly in the interior, going to any rams. And I would like to see what the data says, because clearly if you have any ram and no quota, well, you know, after a few years, you're left with 2-year-olds. That was happening in Alberta in the 50s when, you know, the hunting season was a limit of 1 and he had to be a ram, and most of the males were yearlings because, you know, everything else was getting shot. We want some of these large horn rams to survive to rut as a 7-year-old. So again, if the age structure of the harvest is older rams, I really don't think there's a problem. Apparently, if you look at adult sheep in the Northwest Territories, most of what's getting shot is 9 and 10 years old. That would be fine. That would not have an impact. You know, those rams will have had 1 or 2 or 3 ruts to breed. I really don't know about this idea of slot size, because as far as I know, nobody has tried it. The Ibex management in Switzerland is essentially a slot hunt, because each hunter has a permit for an age class, and I forget exactly how it goes, but it's something like yearling, 2 and 3-year-old, 4 and 6, 7 to 9, and then 10 years and older. Of course, with Ibex, the way the horns grow, it's a little bit easier to tell the age. That is associated with very strict quotas for each age class, and very good information on each population. You know, how many do they have for each age class, because they can see them all in the spring and count them. It'd be an interesting experience to try. Then you run into the problem that really, you know, what is the harvest in all of BC in the Rockies? I think it's less than 100 rams a year. So, you know, before you build a sample size you can really do anything with, it would take a few years. But again, my main take-home message, if you're shooting rams that are 8 years of age and older, you're probably doing fine. If you're shooting 4 and 5-year-olds, you're not.
Here's one back to the Alberta data. Did you look at the proportion of 6-year-olds in Alberta across time? Would you expect that the proportion of this age class will start to be smaller through time?
Yes, so the proportion as 4 and 5 year olds, they kind of dropped off the radar. I mean, there's still a few. The harvest has shifted to the 6 year olds. And it does look like there's starting to be a bit of a decline in more recent years because probably some of the 6 year olds are not legal. Then, of course, some of the things that we don't know is, if your 5 year old is barely legal, does it make it, how much is it going to grow before it becomes a 6 year old? But if you take away the harvest of 4 and 5 year olds, there hasn't really been an increase in the average aged harvest in Alberta. So they're mostly getting shot at 6 and 7 now.
Okay, great. How do researchers distinguish the influence of hunting pressures on horn length from other potential factors that may be at play?
Well, you measure those other factors. So, for example, the very detailed study around mountain, we included data on yearly effects, population density, weather, and other things that we knew affected horn size. When you look at things like harvest data, then you can look at, again, weather effects. Very rarely we have the adequate population density data to really, look at the impact of density. One criticism that has been leveled at this research is that, well, the sheep, the ram horns are shrinking in Alberta simply because there's too many sheep, which is an interesting viewpoint given that the sheep population in the province is stable. And in fact, numbers have been going up in the northern part of the province where the decrease in horn size is not as much as in the south. What we're seeing over time is that the harvest in Alberta is pretty much shifted north. So if you look in the 70s, early 80s, it was mostly south of the Bow, and now a lot more is taken north of the Bow and up into the Wilmore. If this was an environmental effect, and if it was driven by population density, you certainly would not expect that the biggest rams that are being taken are the ones that are coming out of national parks, where there is no youth hunting season. Alberta has a history of having a season, permit for what they call non-trophy sheep, so essentially ewes, and I think that's a very good idea when it's sustainable, as long as you get a good idea of how many sheep you have. I think that's very good. The number of non-trophy permit has been decreased substantially over the last couple of decades, partly as biologists get more concerned about the impacts not only of predation on sheep numbers, but overall in the province, sheep number are more or less stable. There's about 8,000 sheep. There were about 8,000 sheep 25 years ago. But that's a very good question that we do take into account environmental effects when we do this now. There was a very good paper just came out that showed that herds that have experienced pneumonia, they pick up a very strong effect on the horn growth of the rams that have survived. So clearly, there's very, very strong environmental effect. But it's a combination of the pedigree that we have for a mountain with this consistent observation that it's not just that we find shrinkage of horns over time. We find shrinkage of horns over time in areas with very intense selective pressure, and we don't in places with weaker selective pressure. So I'm personally very much convinced that part of what we're seeing is an evolutionary effect. Of course, the elephant in the room is climate change. And if we look at the effect of temperature on horn size, at least around mountain, spring temperature has a positive effect on horn growth. So if anything, at least for some of these high elevation population, climate change over the short term should actually lead to larger horns. So the opposite we're seeing. Very clear effect with Ibex in the Alps that the horns are getting larger as the climate is warming up.
Okay, very cool. There's a lot here. Could you consider to shorten the season and move? Okay, so this question gets a bit complicated, but the example is bigger rams and rams with bigger horns. It sounds like in some European countries they do it where they change the season based on genetics or based on horn length. Are you aware of anything to that effect?
No. I mean, mouflon there's a very good study from Central France that showed that over time, the horns of mouflon, which is this, European semi-wild sheep, have shrunk because of very intense hunting. But I know in some places, particularly interior British Columbia, there are some very strange regulation, half curl and limited entry hunt, and they all overlap. But I'm not really sure what the end point of all that is. Clearly, in the case of Alberta, and I suspect this probably applies to the Rockies in British Columbia, if the hunting season runs until the end of October, you're going to take rams coming out of national parks. And I mean, hunters know this, they camp along the boundary of the national parks. And if you look at where sheep are getting shot in the last week of the season, they're about 20% closer on average to the parks. And clearly there's all of opposition to this idea that we should shut the season earlier because, that's when guys are getting their sheep. But if you close the season in the middle of October, rather than letting it run till the end of October, you still give people the opportunity to go sheep hunting. You decrease the harvest because you're cutting out the second peak at the end of the season, and you're letting these unselected rams that are coming out of the national parks breed in hunted area. Because something else that we've learned is that before the rut comes along, rams go on these exploratory routes. They take these forays, and essentially what they're doing, they're looking for breeding opportunities. So if you come from a national park and you're, say, number 3, number 4 in the hierarchy, and then you move into the hunted area, you're probably number 1 because your competitors have been shot. Your problem is that if you move in November, you're fine. But if you move at the end of October, you risk getting shot. So that genetic rescue is not happening. The parks guys have put a bunch of radio collars now. We started a genetic study to try and quantify how big this issue is. Because from what we're seeing from another study here, sheep in Alberta, much of the movement is in November. Most of the movements in November, but a lot of it is in October. From the middle of October, you start getting these rams that will go, they go 30, 40 kilometers away, and then they may come back and go for another sortie. And they're clearly scouting out breeding opportunities, and they tend to go to areas with lower competition.
Okay, thanks. And so I think I got a better grasp on this question. So I think this person is also wondering about moving rams in areas with lower selective pressure that haven't been exposed to it, moving them into these areas to hopefully provide some sort of genetic rescue over time. And in addition, suggesting to shorten the season to reduce the harvest pressure.
Well, we know that they'll move on their own easily up to 30, 40, 50 kilometers, or probably longer. So unless it's an isolated population, I don't think the moving sheep around is a good idea because, well, before we even start talking about the problem with disease, which is the real problem, and, we all get excited about horns and trophy hunting, but the real problem with bighorn sheep is pneumonia. We've done that around mountain in the sense that because, we had a year of very high cougar predation, we're down to 17 breeding ewes. We brought in some sheep from somewhere else, and we do seem to have got some kind of genetic rescue, not in terms of horn size, but in terms of genetic variability. But Round Mountain is a small, isolated population. We're getting a lot of inbreeding. Most of the sheep you move, they're not going to contribute to the local population because they're going to wander off and get shot, get killed by predators. So I don't think that's a solution because of the cost involved, the likely low chance of success. If you stop the hunting season in the middle of October, in the Rockies where the breeding season is late November, then these rams will move on their own over some pretty large distance. Again, you'd have to look at whether you do have some isolated population, then maybe that'd be a different issue. But it's one of the very interesting things about sheep. They're extremely philopatric. So the rams that are born, I work with two populations, Sheep River and Mountain. 95% of them will stay where they're born, but they'll move during the rut. So they'll go and rut somewhere else. That's how they avoid inbreeding, and they'll go like I said, 40, 50 kilometers away, but then they come back. So there is very, very little demographic dispersal. You know, the sheep is born here, moves over there. But there's a lot of this genetic dispersal that they go, breed, and then they come back. And mountain goats do the same.
Okay, awesome. Getting off of sheep for just a second, are you aware, we have some antler restrictions for moose in the province. Are you aware of any work that's been done on the effect of antler point restrictions on moose and those effects?
Not on moose, there's a lot of work done on deer. And in terms of genetic effect, as far as I can tell, there is absolutely nothing. There is clearly some phenotypic effect. So there's a lot of work on white-tailed deer that show that antler restrictions do increase the age at harvest, but then they can create a selective pressure for yearling whitetail that's got branch antlers, more likely to be shot under that kind of regulation, the one that's a spike. But the kind of genetic evidence that I showed for bighorn sheep, I'm not aware of any for any kind of deer species. Doesn't mean that it's not happening, because not too many people have pedigrees or have looked at it properly, but it certainly, the evidence that exists is not very strong. Clearly, once you have a selective hunting, you will select. So I know that in BC, there's some of these areas where it's what's it called, the palmated moose that has to have a, well, you know, if the hunting regulations say that those are the only ones you can kill, well, there's going to be fewer of those. But just because they've been removed by the hunt, it doesn't mean that the overall antler shape will change. Well, the antler shape of the ones that are there will change because the ones of a certain type have been killed. But you will not, that I'm aware of, there is no evidence that you will get a genetic change favoring a certain shape of antler rather than another. It might be because antlers are reformed every year, so maybe there's a stronger environmental impact. So as I said in a couple of papers, for deer, for any kind of service, you know, caribou, moose, elk, whatever, there does not seem to be any evidence of a genetic change caused by selective hunting.
Okay, great. I've got one for you here. Given the impetus to this was really this decline in sheep in the Kootenay region. Without, we live in this land where we're broke all the time and have the most underfunded Fish and Wildlife Management Agency in North America, given what we have. Where do you go when we experience a large decline? What are a couple of the things off the top of your head where we could really be focusing in on to try to restore sheep populations?
Okay, I don't think, from a cursory look that I've had so far, I wouldn't say that the ram hunt is your problem. So what affect sheep population dynamics? Well, pneumonia, and usually we know what is pneumonia because you find dead sheep all over the place, and there's been a few breakout in BC. It's much more insidious to get chronic form. And there's some excellent work that's been done in the States around Ellis Canyon that shows that in some herds you have these carriers, individual ewes that carry the disease, and they keep causing high lamb mortality. And if you can identify those and remove them, you actually get an improvement in population growth. The other thing that we found out in both bighorn sheep and mountain goat, especially cougar predators. And that is a little bit hard to pick up unless you're there all the time. And again, it's not at all a matter of a generalized cougar predation. Most cougars out there hunt deer. Cougars evolved with deer, that's what they hunt. What we got, and we got it multiple times now in 2 sheep population and 1 mountain goat population, is what looks like an individual that specializes on either sheep or goat. And when that cat dies, the problem goes away. And when we do have this case of predation, we also have this indirect effect of lower reproduction and lower growth. Those are, if you're spending a lot of time in the field, then you can pick it up, but it's hard because, the cat kills a sheep and eats it. And unless you find it, it's, and then obviously nutrition. And that's where things like climate change, changes in many places in the Rockies, although maybe not as much as we think. The tree line is going up. Fires usually are a good idea habitat clearly can play a role over the longer term. Over the shorter term, is pneumonia or predation, but certainly nutrition is something else that you could look at. With the long-term database on horn annuli of the rams that were harvested, that's certainly one place where one could look at. Again, one has to keep in mind this bias that if the ram is small, it doesn't show up in the sample, but certainly, looking at difference in horn growth may tell you something.
Thank you. Okay, so if there was another genotype that you would like to study that you would think would affect positive or negative sheep survival on today's landscape, what would you study and why?
Ooh, well, I'd always wanted to do more work with thin horns, dolls and stone sheep, and I tend to apply to thin horns what we learned from big horns, and sometimes I want there because the pattern of horn growth is different, maybe the survival is different. I certainly wouldn't mind working with a meta population. Most of the work I've done is with Ram Mountain, which is an isolated population, so you don't get a lot. We do have a few rams that come in during the rut, but in terms of what drives genetic diversity and exchanges between herds, I think that's certainly a very promising avenue for more research. Otherwise, I'm a little bit stumped. I'm not totally sure what I would answer to that question.
Okay, here's one just on the refuge and protection of mines in the BC Rockies. Do you think they act similar to national parks in Alberta on sheep herd behavior?
Definitely. Well, I don't know in BC, but that's really what's happening in Alberta. The reclamation in mines provides excellent sheep habitat. We've seen that at Academy, we've seen that at the Smoky River, and because people cannot go, they provide the same as national parks. I mean, Alberta gives out that special. Well, BC does it as well. And that's where these really big rams are coming out of these areas we've reclaimed mine sites where, essentially there's artificial new sheep habitats being created. The other reason why those rams are big is because of the soil condition, the Chinook, and they get to live to be 10 to 12. That is also, part of the equation. But yeah, if you have protected habitat with very good grass production and no hunting, then it's the same as a national park. And sheep, unfortunately, they're not the greatest species to use to argue against some of these development projects. I would definitely look at caribou, mountain goats, but from what I've seen, sheep, usually the problem is hard to keep them away. If there is grass, they'll go there as long as nobody's shooting them.
Okay, and then maybe one last one between Moby and Blue Tongue in Alberta, and there's a question: have they experienced issues with Blue Tongue in Alberta? Do you think the hands will be forced in terms of regulation changes in response to a population reduction?
I don't know anything about Blue Tongue. I'm sorry, I haven't heard of it being a problem. Alberta tends to have fewer problems in British Columbia with pneumonia because it does not have the history of domestic sheep. So the big pneumonia die-off in Alberta have been south of the Bow River, and quite a few of them have actually come in, they started in Montana, British Columbia. But again, as I said before, we spend all this time talking about horns, but really if you're concerned about sheep management, domestic sheep are a threat. And domestic goats. I'm sorry, I don't know about Blue Tongue.
Okay, well, I think that's great, and now it's just about 10:30 your time. So, thank you so much for taking the time to present. for everybody that tuned in tonight. I think we had probably 120 people. Thank you very much. These webinars are for you, for the membership and the public and other stakeholders and First Nations. I hope you learned a ton tonight. I hope we can really focus in on managing sheep sustainably, and especially down south here, working on some restoration efforts to start to increase the bighorn sheep population in the Kootenays. And then of course in the Okanagan, we've got another Movi outbreak here. So we have our challenges. The next webinar is going to be February 22nd. It's going to be with the Forest Practices Board again. It'll be on improving forest practices to protect water. They're going to talk about the legislation requirements of licensees, and then talk about how we can improve regulations and how we can do a better job of taking care of our water. So again, make sure you share this with your friends, talk to your coworkers and your colleagues. And for those of you that meet with your MPs and MLAs, you can bring this up with them. And again, Dr. Festa-Bianchet, thank you for taking the time. And I realize it's really late, so we really appreciate you coming on.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. I think it's extremely important. I get to talk to hunter and people interested in conservation of mountain ungulates. And you can see I can't talk horns forever. So if anybody's any question, I'm reachable by email. I'd be quite happy to answer any additional questions that remain, because I really think that the involvement of hunters in conservation is extremely important. So thanks, Jess. This was a real pleasure, and I'm glad if people learned something.
I'm sure they did.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.